The Honourable the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, what we saw today ought to be very salutary for members and for members of the press gallery.
Order them in for Mayor.
Because what we saw today was the Leader of the Opposition. It's just like any other Leader of the Opposition. Just like any other Leader of the Opposition. This is the first bit of pressure he's been under. In 6 months of a dream ride, the first bit of pressure, and we saw 10 minutes of a rattled person with a rattled speech. 10 minutes.
Order.
10 minutes.
Order. Order. The member for Dundas.
At 5 minutes before the completion, my colleagues and I said, "Where are you going to get round the policy?" He said, "I'll get round the policy." At that stage, we'd had 10 minutes of abuse of the government. 10 minutes of abuse. Abuse which said that I am despicable and gutless. Now, you can't have a second go.
Point of order.
You can't have a second go. Glass jaw.
We're going to have a sensible debate on this issue. Pick up the policies that are there.
Members on my left will
What are you talking about? I mean, you talk about a glass jaw, you get 1 minute of criticism and you've got to get up to try and take a point of order. Then you said I won't debate you. I've offered you 7:30 tonight on the 7:30 report tonight. You know I have, and you'll probably squib that. And maybe I might goad you into it. Maybe I might goad you into it. Maybe I might goad you into it. What we heard was you've been under a little bit of pressure for the first time because you couldn't even support one budgetary measure by the government. So you come in here today with a speech which showed you to be as rattled as we believed you were, and which the press believed you were. And the result is, what we took then was 10 minutes of abuse from you. Abuse for me that I was despicable and gutless. The litany of things saying, why haven't you got the guts to do this? Why haven't you got the guts to do that? Then you went on to say the self-pity line. That's right, he said, stand up and denigrate Hewson, which has become a sort of a national, this is a crime. He's the opposition leader, but if you propose anything and you attack him for it, it's denigrating Hewson. This little flower, this little delicate little beauty, this little cream puff, is supposed to be beyond personal criticism. And if any of us dare legitimately say, well, we don't think that $40 billion of social spending ought to be thrown to people who operate voluntary agencies, he says it's a personal attack upon me. That's right, denigrate Hewson. And when it gets down to it, then he made these offers about how he would cut $3 billion from expenditure. And yet, as my colleague said, Mr Howe said, you couldn't even take a cent off the millionaires who are getting over $60,000 a year, and you can still keep the family allowance, a home free of the test, and $500,000 of assets net of debts, and you couldn't take a cent from them. You never complained about our measures on the family allowance supplement, did you? Where the third child picks up $1,800 and where we've tightened up the test there. Oh no, you weren't going to complain about that because that was tightening up the test on the poor. But if it's tightening up the test on the rich, oh no, you weren't going to have a bar of that. You were going to have nothing of that. And so you couldn't even get through your party room as a new leader. As a new leader, you couldn't even get through your party room as support for a proposition as reasonable as that. And yet you fraudulently offer us support, you say, for $3 billion worth of expenditure cuts. And then you go on to talk about genuine reductions in protection, which is the only government in Australia in the post-war years which has reduced protection. The Labor governments. 25% in 1973-4 and a 33.33% reduction to an average level of manufacturing protection of 7% by 1992 and going further. And you enjoin us for further genuine reduction in protection. I mean, the gall of you, the unmitigated gall of you. And you sat as an advisor to Howard for 7 years and you sat with these protection levels untouched when you knew that you were the sentries at the gate and being called upon to put the remedial changes into Australian policy. And you did nothing about it. You said, and give us a second runway in Sydney. You were in government for 30 years. Why wasn't there a second runway in Sydney? Because you would never take the decisions. You thought you'd lose the seats around the airport. I mean, you had no damn courage and you never have. Then you say you wanted reform of the personal tax scales. Reform of the personal tax scales. You were Treasurer Howard's advisor for 5 years. You had the oil boom in revenues from Bass Strait in the second OPEC price surge. And when I picked up the game, we had a top marginal rate of 60%. That's now 47. The bottom rate was 30. It's now 21. The corporate rate was 46. It's now 39. And then the rate of tax on distributed income was 78 cents in the dollar. It's now 39. And you've got the gall to say you will support us in genuine reductions, genuine changes to the personal tax system. You opposed the capital gains tax, you opposed the fringe benefits tax. The only thing you've supported we've done was dividend imputation because we gave business the removal of the double tax on dividends, which you should have done 30 years earlier. And you're up here telling us genuine offers for help. The fact is, you don't have the strength you showed this week in your own party room. I noticed the Premier of New South Wales had a comment to say about today. He said the first rule is that the opposition leader is always right as far as his colleagues are concerned. And the second rule is that if he's wrong, go back to rule 1. I think that rule would be a salutary piece of advice to the federal opposition, said Premier Greiner, and spot on. And spot. He understands the value of strength, but you this week you've been pathetic. And if I might borrow a phrase from an old Conservative friend of yours, you were simply like a shiver looking for a spine to run up in your party room, not even able to stand up your own back bench for a measure you knew was entirely reasonable. And then you come in here denigrating, stand up and denigrate Hewson as if you hold some virtue, as if you hold some virtue. What virtue do you hold? You and Howard sat here for 7 years in the period when the changes should have gone in, and you watched the place sink and sink into a place which was just clogged with sclerosis. A regulated economy, high tariffs, a managed exchange rate, a clogged financial market, a huge budget deficit, high tax rates, high unemployment, high inflation. What virtue do you think we should have from you that you should say denigrate Hewson? Why shouldn't we denigrate you when you stand up without policy prescriptions? Or worse, send $40 billion worth of Commonwealth expenditure on the aged and the poor to the soup kitchens, which is what you've been proposing. And then when we have the temerity of saying that's not a policy, that we stand up and denigrate you. I mean, we have been the sole government that stood up and took upon all of the post-war years of economic neglect. This crazy, crazed belief that commodities alone would save Australia's bacon, that we only needed to dig up another mound of rocks and grow another paddock full of wheat, and that we could pick goods from the shelves of the world and take the creativity of other people and live with a first world standard, with a third world economy. That's the sort of position you left us in. And you knew it was changing, and in the 70s, when it was obvious that the terms of trade had moved against us, when the Japanese came down in the second oil shock for coal, for the OPEC replacement, for coal from Australia, said, happy days are here again. We don't have to do any of the hard things. All those restrictive work practices on the ports, we don't have to worry about them. The overmanning of Australian ships, we don't have to worry about them. The lack of competition in telecommunications, we don't have to worry about them. The fact that it costs twice as much for an Australian car with high protection, don't have to worry about it. The fact that it costs twice as much for a singlet or a shirt or a pair of shoes, don't have to worry about it. The fact that we can go on spending in country party electorates and blow out the budget to produce huge budget deficits, don't have to worry about it. The fact that our inflation rate had got to a perpetual 10% and our competitiveness was right, don't have to worry about it. All those deep-rooted structural things you left to us. And as we struggle to get them down, as we try and turn this from a slothful internal economy to one looking out and trading now with the rest of the world with a great constellation of companies in Europe and North America, your Brambles and your TNTs and your News Limiteds and the breweries, that never happened in the past. As we go out to the world and trade with the world and we open the place up and try and get the winds of competition in with tariff reductions, with changes to the microeconomy, you gloat at our difficulties. You gloat at our difficulties. And what you think is because you're a fresh face, but you're not that fresh because you're around in the days when some of these dastardly things were let happen, that you've just come here without the bib and bub team of Peacock and Howard fighting each other and you come in here with the supposed fresh phrase, that gives you virtue. And without difficulties, which have been basically loaded onto us by 30 years of coalition policy neglect, that you think that, therefore, if we, mere mortal politicians, get up and say, well, how dare you propose this, or this is wrong, or you should support that we're denigrating you. And this is a silly debate you've managed to put about yourself, that somehow you're above politics and you stand for something new. You stand for nothing new. You're just a Commodore Garden Liberal. You're just an ordinary Liberal Party person, up here like any other politician, but like most Liberals without any original ideas, and like most Liberals without any courage. And we saw that this week in the party room. We saw you fancy saying that a test by the government on assets that lets you have $60,000 of income, a house of any value free of the test, and $500,000 of assets net of debt is too tough that it can't be passed by the coalition. To be rolled by this character here and the agrarian rump in the National Party. I mean, imagine the ignominy of being rolled by the rump end of Australian politics. The farmyard gaggle from the National Party. Oh, you goose. Mr. Speaker, that's the position of the leader. That's the position of the leader of the opposition.
Order.
Now, the fact is, Mr. Speaker, we are making progress on the big structural things. The current account is improving structurally. We have virtually remodernised the Australian economy in the last few years. You cannot go through an Australian capital city without seeing a totally changed cityscape. All of the new tourist developments right up the Australian coast, $300 and $400 million a throw. All of the investment in our capital stock in secondary industry, all of that is replacing all that burnt-out industrial archaeology you left us with. That's now been replaced anew. That's turning the current account around, as is the change on inflation. Australia now has a lower rate of inflation than the OECD. The Australian inflation rate is 6%, the OECD is 6.6%, the United States is 6.2%. Britain, your model is 11. 11. And Margaret Thatcher's now looking at wage settlements of 15%. You know what ours was yesterday for the year to September? 6.8. 6.8 against Margaret Thatcher's 15. So our Accord delivered 6.8 in a boom, which is now giving us decelerating inflation. Your hero, Mrs Thatcher, is presiding over 15% and an 11% inflation rate. And Britain's now, in desperation, tied its exchange rate to the Deutschmark, and British industry will be flooded with European imports as they carry Mrs Thatcher to a political grave. That's what's going to happen. And there the progress has been made on inflation, but no cheer from the opposition on the current account deficit and on the big structural things. My colleague and I, yes, we did have our point of view about telecommunication, but he's got the change. He's in there. He's got a competitor for telecom. You never did. You turkeys never did. You turkeys never did. We've got the changes on the wharves. We've got the changes going. Last week we started with a deregulated airline industry. If you want to buy a smoky old 727, you can fly between Sydney and Melbourne if you can make a buck out of it. But you couldn't when you were around because you did your deals with Reg Ansett with your two-airline policy. The fact of the matter is you people have never stood for anything decent in terms of policy as long as you've been here. None of you. And you've never actually ever tried to do anything, ever tried to put your political skins at risk. You always cover. Well, don't. Send him back to his playpen, Mr Deputy Speaker. Send him back to his playpen. Mr Deputy Speaker, the fact of the matter is you've never ever tried because you always put your political hide ahead of the national interest. And Mr Speaker, I think it's time we saw today, finally, the opposition leader failed in the party this week, under pressure, up with a rattled speech, 10 minutes of the 15 of which was just straight abuse of the government, of me, the Prime Minister and ministers, because you'll see more and more. This is a game for stayers, not players. Mr Deputy Speaker, you'll see more and more of these rattled, intemperate performances, and you'll see more and more of the replies of substance from the government.